Thanks to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video. For more information, check the affiliate link in the description. Recently, Android announced a new brand identity for its mobile OS, updating its logo with a new wordmark and a 3D version of the iconic robot head, which ended up being the inspiration for this episode of the logo animation series. I'm super excited for today's tutorial as we're going to be recreating the wordmark in Illustrator, then bring that into After Effects so we can animate it, as well as set up a reference which we'll use to model the robot in 3D by using the free software Blender, set up the materials and rigs for the blinking eyes, wobbly ears, and the rest of the body so we can finally animate, light, render, and composite it together with the wordmark back in After Effects. We're going to cover the whole process step by step, so it's going to take some time, but there will be chapters for each part in case you want to skip to a certain section. One last thing before we get started, make sure to check out previous tutorials on this channel. There's plenty of cool things for you to learn, and most of them come with project files, including ones from this tutorial that you can grab on my Gumroad page, which is a great way to support the channel, along with super thanks tips, or join as a member with a monthly donation and get access to extra perks such as free project files that would otherwise have to be paid for. With all that said, let's jump right in and get started. Alright, so here we are now in Illustrator, and I've gone ahead and imported this image as reference for the Android wordmark, which I grabbed off of this Android YouTube channel video. And normally we would skip this part, but seeing as this new logo isn't really out yet online, we can do this one of two ways. We can either recreate it from scratch by either using the pen tool and tracing around the letters, or use the image trace function, which is under Window, Image Trace, and then select this image and turn on preview. And for the most part, it does a pretty good job, especially if you're using images that are very contrasty. So in this case, the letters are pure black and the background is white. But you can still see some errors here at the D and also here at the other D. And this is mostly because of the low quality image. Under the image trace panel, you can tweak the threshold. Maybe that'll help you fix some of these issues. And I'm not looking for this to be perfect, just as long as we get a decent enough trace out of it. Now we can uncheck preview and then hit trace. Once that's finished, you can go over to object and click expand while the image is still selected. Leave both of those options on and then hit OK. And there we have a group inside of another group, and there's our letters. Now with all of them selected, go to Object and then hit Ungroup or Ctrl-Shift-G. And then do it again to ungroup twice. Now we can close the image trace panel and see if we need to do any cleanup. Well, let's say maybe this here needs to be straight. So we can hit Ctrl-R and then bring a guide down here so we can snap at the bottom. And then make sure this goes straight horizontally. And then maybe hit P to bring up the pen tool and minus that path. And then do the same thing for the other side. And then we can select the guide, delete it. And I'm thinking this D letter is a bit better looking compared to this one. So let's select this one, hold down Alt as you click and drag to duplicate it, and then hold down Shift to snap it horizontally so it doesn't move up or down. And then switch to the bottom one, delete that one. And now let's make some selections around these letters. So for example, the A letter, you can see that's made up of two of these layers. So with both of those selected, we can use the Pathfinder tool and click on the second option, which minuses the front layer. So now it's a single layer, and we'll do the same thing for the D. Minus that, same thing here, and then same thing for the O. Just make sure you don't select anything else besides that. Click the minus front. Now let's do some house cleaning. We'll reorder these layers and rename them. Now, because of the way we're going to be animating these letters to kind of draw in one by one, we need to make sure that certain letters are split into two parts. So let's select A, Control-C to copy, and then Control-F to paste in place. We'll hide one of them, and we'll zoom in. Let's see, delete this one, delete that one. And then we'll hit P, connect these 2 points and these 2 points. So now we have just that part of the A. Then we'll duplicate this one, turn off one of them, re-enable the previous copy, and then select both of them and then hit minus front. So now we're left with only this part on one layer and then this part on the other layer. Let's rename that to A connector. And we'll do the same thing for the D letters. So let's Control C, Control F to duplicate. And let's select these top points, delete them. And let's select these ones, delete those. Hit P and then do kind of like a curve. We'll minus this one and then curve out this point. Oops, we need to go closer. Now let's disable that one and re-enable this one, and we'll delete those points. Now let's close those out, delete this middle point, and maybe even this one. Actually, let me re-enable this. I was wrong because we do need it. We want this to not come out at this part because then we don't get that curve. You can see the other D is just a perfect circle there. Maybe we'll add a point right here and then hold down Alt to bring up the anchor point tool and just curve it up just a little bit and then push it over to here. Doesn't matter that it's not straight. The animation is going to be happening very quickly, so you won't even be able to notice that it's curved instead of just a straight line. All right, we'll rename this one to D circle and this one to D line. Select both of them, Alt, duplicate to the other side, and then delete this and bring them at the bottom. We'll also rename this to Android. All right, so there's our wordmark recreated perfectly. Now we can go ahead and send this over to After Effects and get things ready for animation. To do that, we can either save this as an Illustrator file, import that into After Effects, and then convert that into shape layers. But the problem is that it's not gonna retain the layer naming and ordering. So we're gonna have to do double the work then, reorganize, rename, and everything like that. So instead, what I like to do is use this third-party tool, Overlord, which you do have to pay for, but trust me, it's very well worth it because it saves you so much time. Look, I can select all of them. There's this option that says split shapes to layers. So each of these layers will be on its own layer back in After Effects instead of just being one shape layer with multiple groups. And then click this button which says push selection to After Effects. And there you go, we have all of them inside of After Effects split into their own layers with the names retained. Now, before we continue, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. All right, now let me shut these off for a moment and then enable all of these other layers that I have down here. I want to take a moment to talk a bit about the animation concept and how I came up with all of this stuff. So for the most part, I used reference from Android's previous animations that they had. So for example, at the beginning here, this clip is from a previous video. I think it was like back from 3 years ago or something like that. And then over here, you can see this one fades out, but I've left this one at the bottom. So this is how the letters are gonna animate. And then finally it pushes to the side and we get this 3D head of the robot scaling up. But at the same time, what we're gonna do is animate it so it rotates as it's scaling up, and also the ears kind of wobble around, and we get this blink at the end. And for that, I referenced this video, which is from their most recent campaign. So I pretty much combine all of these things to come up with a final concept. But anyway, let's solo the background together with all of the letters. And first things first, we'll stop for a moment and think about how we're gonna be animating each of these parts. So I know that these vertical lines on the D's and the I letter are gonna be animating upwards. So I could say hit Y to bring up the anchor point tool and then hold down Control to activate snapping. And that way we can scale it up and down like that. And we can do that one by one for each letter. But there's actually this very nifty tool that I use. It's free to download. It's called Reposition Anchor Point, which allows you to select multiple layers at a time, set the anchor point position, and then hit reposition. And then maybe for the A connector, you could do the same, set the anchor point to the center left. But if we do that, the problem is that you're able to see this sort of lip at the bottom, which is part of the design, but I don't want them to be visible as this one is revealing itself. So instead, I'll use Control-Alt-Home to center the anchor point to that layer. And first, we'll scale it up just a little bit, so we get rid of those aliasing issues. You can see if we zoom in here, because in After Effects here, we're working with pixels, you'll sometimes see those aliasing issues. So let's maybe do 102. And now that's scaled up enough to the point where you're not able to see the gap in between. And let's go back to the beginning and we'll start animating these ones first. So the D lines, hit Control-Shift-H to reveal the UI elements and then hit S to scale, set a keyframe. We'll move forward by 20 frames, so hold shift and then page down twice, which will move forward by 10 frames each. Set a keyframe there, then go back, unlink the scale value, and then set the Y value to 0. So now you can see they go up like that. And then let's do the D letters and the O. So let's select the first one, and I'll do Control Space to bring up FX Console, which is also a third-party free tool. And that allows you to search for an effect and then hit Enter to quickly add it instead of using the Effects and Presets panel or going over to the menus, God forbid. Now let's reposition this center point over there. So now when we increase the transition completion, it goes like that. But we do need to shift the angle and then animate the transition completion. We go from 100%, hit U to reveal it, over to 0. And we'll keep the timing the same. And once we have everything set up, keyframe wise, we'll tweak the easing as well. Now we can copy this and paste it over to the other one. Just make sure you reposition the center point. Oh, and also we need to tweak the angle. I don't know why I didn't copy that over. And we'll do the same for the O letter. And also remember that wherever your playhead is at the time of pasting the keyframes, that's where the first keyframe is going to be set, and then every keyframe is going to be moved over after that. Let's also shift the angle on this to -180, so it goes like that. And now let's do the A connector, which uses a similar effect, but it's a linear instead. Now, if we zoom in, you can see the transition completion, it says 0%, and you would maybe think that it's gonna be 100% of this area, but no, this actually uses 100% of comp size. So it's gonna be very specific to this letter. So we just need to dial this in until we see some change happening. So I guess at 36%, but in fact, flip this -90 first, and then tweak the value. And I'm holding down Control, which will scroll these values in 0.1 increments. So in this case, it seems to be 66%. We'll go over to the beginning, set a keyframe, move over here, go over to the other side, 62%, and then hit U, and we'll move forward by 1 frame and set this down to 0%, just because if we go back and we're at 62% still, if we move this around, you can see because it's using comp size, you might risk the chance of this disappearing on you. So just to make sure, we'll go forward by 1 more frame and set that down to 0%. So now there's no way this is going to disappear. Now for the other part of the A, the N letter, and the R letter, we'll use what are called alpha mats. So with nothing selected, hit G to bring up the pen tool. And when you click without having anything selected, it will generate a shape layer. So let's just draw this kind of a shape. Make sure you bring this up. And now with the new properties panel, which is very nice indeed, we can set the fill to none and then increase the stroke width. Maybe set the line cap and join to round and then tweak this. And this way we can use this as a matte for the bottom layer and then use a trim paths effect to trim the stroke, which will in turn reveal the A letter underneath. So set a keyframe there and then go down to 0% at the beginning. Remember, move forward by 20 frames and make sure the keyframe is at that point. And we'll use the same technique with the N and R letters. All right, so we've animated every single letter apart from the I circle dot at the top, but we'll take care of that one after we finish the easing of the keyframes. So let's select all of these keyframes, hit F9 to easy ease, and then let's say select these 2 top keyframes of the A matte, turn on the graph editor, and then we can go over to the value graph, which is where I like to work most of the time, and then select this top point. We'll drag this over like so, and then select the bottom point and then drag it over just a little bit so we have more interesting easing going on. Now I'm thinking we can maybe drag these over to 1 second. And now for the A connector, we want to shift the timing so it starts after this point right here. So maybe over there. And then we could even control click on this to turn it back into a linear keyframe so it immediately starts and maybe hits the other side by the time this fills out. Let's say like that. And then use the same method for the D letters. We'll have the line scale up until there and only then have the circle start to come in. Control click on that to turn it into a linear keyframe. Let's go by 20 frames. We could also go back to the graph editor and drag this over so it goes a bit faster. And again, for the purpose of saving time, we'll duplicate these, bring them over here so we can use them as reference. We can tone down the opacity so we can move these over into place and then delete these. Oh, and of course, because we shifted the position, we need to make sure this is back at the center right here. Now let's shut off whatever we've taken care of so far and take care of the easing for these ones. And I'm also thinking that these circles should take a bit longer to finish. All right, so after playing around with the easing for about 1,000 years, I ended up with this. Now let me also take care of the I dot and then hold down Shift, hit P to bring up the position while also keeping the scale visible. So I can go back and let's say set a keyframe for both of those, and we'll go forward by 20 frames, set a keyframe there, then go back by 10 frames, and then we'll push it up just a little bit. And then for the first one, we'll push it down and also scale it down to like 50%. And now move forward in time, we'll push this over so that it starts coming out from underneath the eye line. So let's say at frame 10. But of course, we need to play around with the easing. First of all, let's take care of the easing for the scale. Drag that over and then hit F9 on all of them. And now one thing to note for the position in After Effects, if you're using the value graph and the X and Y are merged into one, meaning you haven't checked the separate dimensions option, you won't be able to tweak the easing with the value graph. So you're going to have to separate the dimensions and then maybe uncheck the X position because we're not animating that. And this way we can focus on the Y position and just easy ease those and then rotate it like that and then drag this over. So it kind of overshoots a little bit. Maybe go over to the first keyframe, hit U, and we want this to start coming out just a little bit sooner maybe, but also push it down even further. All right, let's give that one last preview. Looking good, looking nice. Now let's go ahead and create a new null object and then parent everything to it. Then set a keyframe for the position, move backwards, set a keyframe there, and then go back to the end frame, re-enable the original reference so we can use that to reposition this back into place. Zoom in. And now seeing as we're on this keyframe, we can parent the head to the null. Now it goes back with it. And then let's hide that text. And also let's bring up the keyframes for this head. And we'll use those keyframes as guides for where we want our letters to come in as well. So push those over. And now you can see I've already easy eased these keyframes. And instead of doing the same for these ones, I actually want to copy the exact same easing velocity from these keyframes. So a tool I like to use is the Ease Copy plugin, which is also free. And by the way, I'll make sure to leave links to anything I mentioned throughout this video in the description. So with those keyframes selected, we can copy them and then select these other two keyframes and then paste the easing of those. So now they have pretty much the same easing velocity. I do also want to shift the timing of the letters. As soon as they reach the end of their animation, that's where it starts pushing to the side. Maybe with a bit of overlap. It's always nice to have some overlap in your animation. So it's not like, okay, one thing happens, there's a pause, then another thing happens. Instead, you crossfade those movements so you can never see where the seam is, essentially. Yeah, that looks pretty cool. All right, now back to the beginning. We'll re-enable the flying robot. And you can see here I've set this to be a guide layer. Now I want to disable the guide layer option because I want this to show up in the final render. And the reason we're going to be rendering this out is so that we can use it as reference when we're doing the work in Blender, which is going to be the next step. So let's set the in point and the out point, let's say at 4 seconds, and then hit N, set the end point of our timeline, then hit Control M to add to render queue, and we'll switch this format to PNG sequence. Now let's set the destination and finally hit render. Oh, we're done. Another thing I want to do is grab a screenshot of this Android body logo. You can see it's a mashup between the old one, so disable the mask, and disable the fill. This is like an old version of their logo. So I just cut it up, set the mask to subtract on the head, and then replace the head with the newer version. And then we'll use FX Console to export a PNG image. Now finally, moving on to Blender, we'll hit Shift A to add an image as a plane, locate where that reference image is. And then here under the material type, we can set that to shadeless. Switch over to material preview mode, then hit RX90, and now we'll disable the selection so we can't click on it, and then hit the -Y button on the gizmo here to switch to the front orthographic view. And finally, we can start modeling. So let's hit Shift A again. We'll bring up a cylinder, and then hit Tab to go into edit mode. We'll hit A to select all faces, then hit S to scale them down, then hit Alt Z to toggle X-ray mode, which is the same as clicking this button up here. And that way we can select through the vertices and then bring these down, and then also bring these down as well to here. So in line with the bottom part. And now we'll Control B to bevel the bottom points and then just drag this up until this point here where the curve of the logo starts, and then scroll up on your mouse wheel so we get enough vertices to get that smooth curve, and then hit left click to confirm. Now go out of edit mode and right click shade smooth. Then we'll go back, we'll hit tab again. Let's select the top points this time and we'll zoom in and we'll do Control B to bevel. We'll do a single. Now let's go to the modifier tab and we'll add a subdivision surface. Alternatively, you can hit Control 1, which will add a subdivision surface modifier as a shortcut and assign the level of subdivisions based on the number you hit. Now, back at the front orthographic view, you can see that the subdivision kind of messed up the shape, and that's because of the way the subdivision modifier works. It essentially averages out 2 points and then tries to curve that point by adding another point in the middle. So to counteract that, we can go into edit mode and we'll add an edge loop. So Control R and then click and drag it up so we tighten that curve. And another thing we could do is now Alt click on the very top edge to select the edge loop and then hit Control B and we'll bevel that out so we get the very tight curve. And we'll just do like one subdivision on the bevel. And you can see we have just a little bit of a curve right there. It'll help catch the light a bit more instead of being like a 100% sharp edge. Also, you could say crank up the subdivision to 2 levels as well, but just keep in mind that the higher you go, the more subdivisions you're gonna have on your mesh, which might slow down your computer, but in this case, it's not really gonna be a problem. But anyway, there's our torso, and now we'll create the limbs. So we'll do Shift A again, go to Mesh. Instead of using UV sphere, it's got these sort of triangulated topology at the top and bottom parts. We'll delete that, and we'll actually use a round cube, which normally you shouldn't be able to see this, but if you go over to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then search for extra, you have this add-on that says extra objects for adding meshes. So I like to use round cube, pop open this menu at the bottom, and just make sure that the size is the same as the radius to get a perfect sphere. And then drag this over, we'll scale it down, and just make sure that this sphere is sort of sitting at the center of this imaginary circle right here. And in fact, we can go Control 1 to add a subdivision and then scale it up just a little bit. And we can go over to 2 levels, search for safety, right click, shade smooth. Now tab into edit mode and we'll select the bottom half of the sphere and just make sure that again, you're in X-ray mode by toggling it with Alt Z so that you select all the vertices through the mesh, and then hit E to extrude it downwards. I don't know if you can notice that there's a bit of a curve instead of being like a straight line. We can go back into edit mode, we'll do Control R and we'll scroll up once to get 2 edge loops, left click to confirm, then right click to disable the movement, and then hit SZ to scale it upwards on the Z axis. So now we have a perfect line. Now let's duplicate it, Shift D, we'll move it at the bottom here. Let's just make sure it sits flush with the logo like so, and then go into edit mode and we'll drag down all of these top points just until we hit this bottom point. Before we go out of edit mode, let's hit Shift S to set the cursor to the selection, and then go out of edit mode and then right click, set origin to 3D cursor. So the origin jumps back to the center of those points. And now again, we can rotate it around that point. By the way, I'm hitting double R, so RR to go into free rotate mode. Shift click on this one to select both of those limbs, and we'll do Shift D to duplicate, and then right click to cancel the movement, and then hold down Shift and left click on the torso to make it the active object. You can see it's got sort of a lighter orange, and then hit Control P to parent to object, and now those 2 limbs are parented to the torso, and we'll do RZ 180. Now let's select those 2 limbs, Alt-P to clear the parent but keep the transformation so they stay in place. Now, if we select both of them and hit N to bring up the toolbar and go under the item menu, you can see that the Z is now -180. So let's go RZ180, hit enter, and I don't know why, but it set it to 0.7 there, I don't know. Click on it, hit 0, and hold down Alt as you click enter, which will apply that value to multiple selected objects at once. And I'm also noticing that the scale is not 1, which is usually what you would want to do. So let's select all of the limbs, hit Ctrl A to apply the scale, which will make this scale XYZ 1 by 1 by 1. Now let's move on to the head, but before we do that, because the cursor is still there, once we add a mesh, whatever it may be, it will be created at the cursor point. So let's Shift S, cursor to world origin, and then do a round cube. We'll bring it up. We want the center of the sphere to be sitting at the bottom of the head, like so. And again, we're using a round cube because of the topology that it has. So out of edit mode, let's do Ctrl 2 to add 2 levels of subdivision. Back in edit mode, we'll actually delete the bottom vertices and then select all of these. We'll do S, scale them up, bring it up, and we'll actually select these bottom ones, hit Shift S, set the cursor to select it, and then set the pivot to the 3D cursor so we can scale things down from that point. And just make sure we have this be big enough vertically so it hits the top of the head, and then hit S, Shift Z to constrain it on the Z axis so we only scale it up on the X and Y, but not on the Z. And then just increase this outwards like so. Right click, shade smooth, but because we deleted the bottom points, now we have this hole at the bottom. So let's hit / on your keyboard to go into isolation mode, and then hit tab to go back into edit mode. And now we'll select the edge loop by holding Alt and left clicking. And then instead of hitting F, which will fill it up with an N-gon and give you these weird shading issues, instead we'll do Control F to give it a grid fill, which will again keep things into quads. Because of the way the subdivision modifier works, it's gonna smooth out our head. We do want some smoothing. Again, I don't wanna have anything be 100% sharp because in real life, nothing is truly 100% sharp. Let's do Control R to add an edge loop, click, and then drag it down to tighten that curve like so. And you might notice some shading issues here. So we'll do tab again, back into edit mode, back into isolation mode. We'll select middle 4 faces, hit Ctrl+ to expand the selection or grow the selection, and then we'll do I to inset and then drag it down. The more we inset, the more we leave room for the curve. The less we inset, the sharper that turn gets. So maybe something like that is fine. And this way we get rid of the shading issues as well as keep the curve. That looks great. All right, now moving on, we're gonna start adding the details such as the ears and the eyes. For safety's sake, we'll duplicate the head and keep that as a backup. So head backup original. And we'll also do some house cleaning, I guess, at this point. So head F2, by the way, to rename objects. Torso, go back to the head, go into edit mode. The first problem you might notice is that we don't have enough geometry to come up with a circle shape, let's say around this area. So to work around that, we're gonna have to apply the subdivision surface modifier. So now when we go into edit mode, you can see we have much more polygons to work with. So we can select those polygons and then say extrude them. But we're not gonna do that yet. We actually are going to do one more thing before we move on to that, and that is to delete half of our head. So X to delete vertices, and then add a mirror modifier, which will allow us to work on one side of the mesh and then have that mirror over to the other side. It's all about efficiency in this business, let me tell ya. Now, one thing I want to do before I add any more detail or start extruding is I want these faces to sit at the center of the ear. So right now they're just a little bit off. So what we'll do is hit G twice, so GG, which will enable edge sliding, and then move it downwards just a little bit. And now we do need one more level of detail, so we'll do right click, subdivide it one more time, and then right click again. We'll go over to loop tools, which by the way, I'll show you in a moment how you can enable this menu, and choose circle. That way when we hit E to extrude, now we have this ear shape extrusion. Now let me go back just a little bit and go over to edit, preferences, add-ons, and search for loop tools. That's the add-on you want to enable to get access to those tools. Anyway, back here, we'll do E to extrude, and we'll go back to the front orthographic view. Go G to grab, move them down a little bit. And we'll switch over to medium point, and then hit S, maybe scale it down just a little bit, and then hit R. Kind of want to rotate it so it matches the angle of that ear, just as long as it's roughly the same as the original logo. But we still want it to be a round cap at the top, so we'll go back into edit mode, and this time we'll delete all of those faces, and then select the edge loop, hit F to fill that face, and then with the edge loop selected, we'll do Control B to bevel it, and we'll go all the way to the max. As soon as you left click, you'll get this menu at the bottom, and you can enable clamp overlap, so vertices don't go through each other. And also let's increase the segments just a little bit, maybe to 5. We can switch to normal orientation and then just push this upwards. Normals are the direction of your faces, hence why I'm switching to the normal orientation. You can easily push it in that same direction. We can go Alt S to scale it back up a bit along normals, by the way. S is just scaling it up like that. Alt S is scaling along normals. All right, so there we have our round ear, but we don't have as much geometry for a smooth cap. So let's go ahead and add another subdivision surface modifier. We'll leave it at 1 level for now. And then you can see the issue we have again because of the way the subdivision works. Now we get this curve at the bottom. So let's go back into edit mode. And just to see things a bit better, we can toggle the on cage option so we can see what it looks like subdivided even in edit mode. And then we'll do Alt click to select this edge loop, and we have to do all of them because of the way we modeled previously. Now let's just click Control B to bevel, and we'll drag it outwards just enough, tighten up that curve, but we still want to keep a little bit of that curve at the bottom, but I want to tighten it up even more, so let's add an edge loop at the top and then drag it down. Let's make sure that's shaded smooth. There is some weird shading going on right now, but we can fix that if we go over to 2 levels of subdivision. And that's really not going to be too noticeable if we zoom out and even say set the material to something that more closely resembles the green from the logo. There's really not going to be too much of an issue. But let's Control Z to undo. We'll take care of the materials later. And there we have our ear. It's pretty much done. And if you want to smooth out the topology, maybe we can add 2 more edge loops here to keep things a bit more consistent. So if we unchecked optimal display, you can see that the topology is a bit more consistent throughout. And in fact, we'll turn that on and we'll add 3 more edge loops in between here. So we have perfect squares because, you know, we're going to be rigging this out later and we want the topology to be evenly spaced out. And in fact, now that we've tightened everything back up, I'm thinking we go back down to 1 level of subdivision, because also now moving on to the eyes, I want to keep the topology as low poly as possible so it's easier to work with a few amount of faces. So the name of the game is, whenever you can, try to keep it as low poly as possible when editing and let the subdivision surface modifier add the detail and do the rest of the work. And by the way, we can go over to the viewport shading mode and make sure you set the color to texture. And that way you can actually see through the model onto the reference image when you enable X-ray mode. This is going to be very useful now when we get to create the eyes. So let's shift right click over here to set the cursor to that point. Let's go Shift A, add a mesh. We'll do round cube again. And let's set the radius to 0.1 and 0.1. Now we'll select it, go into edit mode, scale it down to roughly match the size, and then go Control 1, do right click, shade smooth, and in fact we'll do 2 levels just so it's perfectly smooth. And then back into edit mode, we'll switch the orientation to global. We'll do SY to scale it down on the Y axis. And now what we want to do is orient this so that it kind of sits flush on the head like that. Let me actually just go SY just a little bit more, and then orient it. Now, instead of doing it manually, which we could do, like maybe switch to local orientation and push it in, try to line it up, What we're gonna do is use this tool, which is under snapping. We can switch to face project so that when we go GY and then hit Control to toggle snapping, you can see it snaps onto the face. And then one more thing we can do is enable align rotation to target, which will also align the rotation of your object to the surface. Now, of course, this is a bit wonky, so let's switch to local view and then go RZ90. and then RX90. And then push it on the y-axis until it sits right in there. And now when we go back to orthographic front view, it does need to go back up a bit, maybe on the global axis like that. And let's just make sure this is sitting properly where it needs to be. Sure, we can do some manual tweaking. It's not a problem. And then maybe push it in halfway through. Now again, we do need the other eyes, so let's parent this to the head, go into orthographic view, we'll duplicate it, and then we'll do RZ in X-ray mode, and then we'll select it, Alt-P, clear parent and transformation, and then Alt-R to reset the rotation on the head, as well as clear the parent for this. All right, at this point, let's make a quick turn and add some materials while we're at it so we can start differentiating these objects. So for the entire body, apart from the eyes, we'll be using one material and then another material for the eyes. So we'll create a new material, we'll do eyes. Let's pick a dark gray color with a low roughness value. In fact, let me switch this to material preview mode and we'll tone that down so it's a sharp reflection, and then increase the specular to like 1. Normally you would keep this at 0.5 for realistic results, but for anything stylized, you can mess around with this, break the rules, whatever you want. As for the head, let me go back to After Effects and we'll create a new solid, pick the color from that, and then copy the hex code, and then create a new material here. We'll do robot, go into the base color, switch to hex mode, and then Control V to paste that color. And we'll go down, let's also decrease the roughness just a little bit to maybe like 0.4. We can go back to these whenever we want. And now let's select this, that, and head last. And we'll do Control L to link materials. And we'll do the I, shift click on this one last, link materials as well. I keep accidentally selecting this, so let's disable the selection. And real quick, let me switch to cycles render mode and disable the scene world. So we're using like a custom HDRI, and also disable the reference image for now. So you can see just how glorious that looks. Let me zoom into the ears. You can see there's really no shading issues present so far. And by the way, I'm noticing around the ear, there's some jagged edges. That's because there's not enough detail. So, you know, we can go back, add another subdivision level. You can see how it's catching the light here. Whereas if it was a completely 100% sharp turn on that edge, you wouldn't be able to catch that light. As a result, it would have looked a lot more fake and not as cool. All right, we'll go back to material preview mode and we'll hide the torso and the limbs, and we'll focus on the face one more time. Here's a video from a previous version of their 3D model that they had. And you can see around the eyes, there's this sort of indent, kind of like a hole where the eye sits, which gives this very cool shading around. And compare that to the new version. It looks like a button on a shirt, something like that. It just sticks on top of the surface of the head. And sure, we could leave it as is. I mean, it looks fine. This is what it looks like in the newer version of the 3D model head. But we'll use the older version as an excuse, just so we can go through it for the sake of the tutorial. So let's select the head. Actually, we'll duplicate it one more time because we're going to be doing some destructive work, and we'll do head ears, hide it, and this one is going to be head eyes indent. So just in case we mess things up, we can go back to an untouched version of the mesh. So let's go into edit mode. Now let's select faces that are roughly around the same area where the eye is, and then hit GG to edge slide them just as before. We want these to be roughly in the center around the eye. And then GG again, we'll do horizontally. And then again, we need more details. So instead of going just loop tool circle, we first need to subdivide it. And then we'll do right click loop tools circle, which you can see is a bit too big right now. So we'll do E to extrude and then S to scale it down. And then we'll do E to extrude along normals. And now if we go over to the cycles render engine, you can see we get this indent around the eye, which is very cool indeed. This is with the indented mesh, and then this is without. So with, without. And you can always go back, select this edge loop, and with the orientation set to normal, we can hit S and then Shift Z to only scale it on the X and Y. We get to notice that indent around the eye a bit more. Maybe that's a bit too much. Tone it down a bit. All right, so we're done with the modeling pretty much. Now we can move on to rigging and finally start animating. So we're getting close. Okay, let's go ahead and Shift D, duplicate the eye, lock it on the X, and we'll do Alt R to reset the rotation. And the reason we're doing that is so we can have an easier time when editing the mesh. Now we'll go over to the data properties panel and then add a shape key, which is what we're going to be using to animate the eyes. That's the basis, so the original shape of the mesh. And then we'll add another one and we'll call this one blink. And here we'll go into edit mode with that shape key selected, hit S, Z to scale it down, go out of edit mode. And now when we set the value all the way up to 1, you can see we get the blink. And that's actually how it looks like in the original animation, just scaled down circle. But the thing is that on this previous 3D model, you can see the blink is a bit more interesting in my opinion. Instead of just being like scaled down, it's also a bit curved, so it looks like it's smiling, which I think looks a lot cuter, so that's what we'll be doing. So back in Blender, we'll tap back into edit mode and then switch to edge selection mode by hitting 2 and then alt click on the middle edge to select that edge loop. And now when we hit GZ, we can move it up, but we actually want to enable proportional editing by hitting O or clicking this button up here. And now hit GZ and move it up. And also use the scroll wheel to increase or decrease the fall off, something like that. But we also want to select the whole thing and bring it back down just so it sits roughly in the middle of the origin point. Look at that. Now let's duplicate this, bring it over, and these two eyes will replace the original eyes. To do that easily, we can enable this add-on that's called Copy Attributes menu. And now we can select this one first, select the one you want to move it to last, Control-C, copy location, Control-C, copy rotation. Then do the same thing for the other one, and delete the original eyes. Oops. But now we have to make sure that we orient these properly. So let's switch to local orientation, and then hit RY. And I want to rotate this so it lines up flat. And then this one as well. And there you go. Look at how cute that looks. But you might notice that the hole is not matching. So we have to also create shape keys for the head. So let's add a shape key for the basis and click on it one more time. Call it blink. And then go into edit mode, and right away you can see that we're still using the mirror modifier, so we don't have a full mesh yet, we just have one side of it and it's being mirrored over, which is not going to be an issue. You can still do the shape keys like so, and then it works with the mirror modifier. But I like to apply the mirror modifier at this point in time, and that way we can stop stressing about maybe having some issues down the line, because it's not a full mesh, it's just being duplicated over to the other side. So let me delete these shape keys because you can't really apply modifiers if you have shape keys on your mesh. And before we apply, we'll duplicate this and then hide it because we want to keep copies just for safety's sake, whenever we're doing something destructive, that is. And then apply the mirror modifier, go back, we'll add the shape keys, do blink, make sure you have the blink shape key selected, and then tab into edit mode. And now we'll start modifying the mesh with the on-cage option so we can see everything to fit around the blink. But as you can see, because we don't have the mirror modifier anymore, it's not doing the same thing on the other side. So you want to enable this symmetrize option on the x-axis. And now we can move that and you'll have the exact same thing happening on the other side. And now it's just a matter of pushing these pixels by using the proportional editing tool. I can enable that. Push these into place, oops, and then tweak fall off. And by the way, you can tab out of edit mode every now and then, make sure the blink is set to 1, so you can preview how that looks like. And I mostly care about what it looks like in the cycles render engine, because that's what we're going to be using to render this out. There's a bit of a gap, so maybe we can push that in. Proportional editing truly is the bestest friend sometimes. Again, I don't want to get rid of all the gaps because then we wouldn't notice the shading much. Yeah, and also you can preview how that eye would close up. And of course, right now everything is controlled individually, but after this, we're going to be rigging things out so we can control the shape keys values with a single object. And also there is the question of if you want to have the added control of individual blinking of the eyes. So you can see right now I can do that for the eyes, but not for the mesh. Let me first just hide these two. Make sure the value is set to 1. So now when we go to new shape from mix, and set this back down to 0 and increase this back to 1, we have the same thing pretty much. And then we'll go into edit mode, go into the front orthographic view, hit C to bring up the circle select and then scale this up. So we can select all of those vertices, maybe Control plus to grow the selection just for safety. And with those vertices selected, we can create a vertex group and we'll call this left eye and assign, and then we'll deselect everything, hit C again, select these ones on the left, right click, Control plus to grow the selection, we'll do a new vertex group, and we'll do right eye, assign. For this one, we'll do blink left, blink right. We'll set them to use the corresponding vertex groups. So for the blink left, we'll do vertex group left eye, and vice versa for the other one. So right eye. And now you can see that the right blink shape key is only affecting those vertices on the right side, and the blink left is affecting the vertices on the left side. That's a very quick and easy way to do things. You can create the shape key for both of the eyes and then isolate the deformation based on vertex groups. Now let's go ahead and bring these back down and re-enable the eyes. And at this point, let's go left eye. See, these are still working. And there you go, there's a wink. Instead of selecting each of these objects and then going to the value and animating by hand one by one, which is going to be a bit tedious, what we can do instead is use drivers to link the shape keys of these objects to bones, and then animate the bones to control the blinking. So let's Shift S on the eye, we'll do cursor to selected, and then we'll do Shift A to add an armature, which will add a bone. Then we can switch this to 3D cursor so we can scale it down like so, and then maybe even RX 90 on the minus and bring it over here on the front. Maybe even bring this up like that, set the origin to center of mass, and then switch back to bounding box. And that's one bone for one eye. Go into edit mode, rename this to eye.left, which is actually very important. You want to name things based on the Blender's naming convention. So Blender prefers to use .L or .R to refer to the left bones or the right bones of your objects. So now, as long as the origin is at the center of the world, you can go right click, set origin to 3D cursor, and back in edit mode, we can select the bone and hit right click, symmetrize. It will copy it over exactly to the left side. And now you can see that this has been automatically renamed to eye.r. And now let's go through the process of rigging one eye. We'll select the blink shape key and then right click on the value and hit add driver. And we'll switch this one to single property and then pick the armature as the object. Now we can go back to edit the driver, which will show up that menu temporarily again, but if you click away, it might disappear. So let's just right click and open the driver editor. And you can see this path value is red right now. That means it's still not linked. So let's select the armature, hit Control Tab to go into pose mode, which is where you would usually do the animation, and select this bone, and then hit N on the 3D viewport. And make sure you hover over the Z axis on the location, because we want to control the blink depending on the Z location of this bone. So right click there and hit copy data path. Then out of pose mode, Control Tab, select this one again, paste that over here. But you can see that it actually doesn't copy the Z location. It just says location. So we'll just type in .Z and hit enter. And now when we go into pose mode, you can see it's actually doing something, but it's still not properly set up. First of all, it's going in the opposite direction. So I want it to blink when I move down. So back into the eye, we'll delete this number. We don't need it. And we'll do -var instead. So now it's going to react if this moves downwards, but it's still going a bit too slow. You can see we have to move it down quite a lot for it to fully blink. So go back, we'll multiply that by maybe 3. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, let me just do 20. And now we can pretty much do the same thing for the head mesh shape key. So for the blink left. So there we go. We have one eye rigged up with a bone. We can pretty much do the same thing for the other one. One more thing you can do is go over to the bone properties under viewport display. You can choose a custom object. So we'll do Shift A mesh circle. In edit mode, we'll scale it down, RX 90, and then maybe delete half of the vertices F to fill those in. Maybe scale it down a bit more. Right click, set origin to geometry. Back on the bones, we'll use that as a custom object. See how it's only doing it for one of the bones? And that's because this bone was the active object in edit mode. If we switch back to this now and do the custom object again, this is now going to affect that bone. And now we can go back into edit mode for this one, scale it up, keep them small. So blink, bone, display, and then we'll hide it from everything. We never need to see it again. But we'll hide those for a moment and now focus on rigging the head and the ears. Let's select the head, Shift S, cursor to selected. We'll do Shift A, armature, go into edit mode, and we'll just bring this down like so. Just make sure this covers the entire head. With this joint selected, we can hit E to extrude over to this side, and E again, extrude up to there, and then delete the connector bone. So we'll just hit X on that. When we go back into pose mode, rotate this bone rotates with the head bone. And that reminds me, we'll go into edit mode, F2, we'll do head. And for this one, we'll do ear.l.001. And remember, we're doing this so we can right click, symmetrize, and it just duplicates it over to the other side. But let me actually show you another method. So let's delete this one and we'll duplicate this and then hit X to lock it to the X axis. And we'll push it maybe over here. Let's just make sure we rename this to ear.r.001. And with this bone selected, if you have the X axis mirror enabled, as soon as you move this, you can see it reflects on the other side. So for example, in this case, I can go right click, subdivide, because I want to add two bones here. That way I can have the ear kind of do this, whoop, 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 and then whoop, the top half also rotates and everything rotates with the head. So those are some nifty tricks for you. Now let's go ahead and skin this, which is the term you use for attaching an armature to a mesh so it deforms with the bones. So we'll select the mesh first and then shift click on the armature and hit Control P, parent with automatic weights, which will create vertex groups on your mesh and then add an armature modifier to it. So now when we select the armature, Control Tab to go into pose mode and then rotate this, rotate the ears, you can see is being affected by the bones. And everything seems fine except for the bottom ear bones, which we're gonna fix in a bit by tweaking the weight of these bones. As I mentioned before, once you parent with automatic weights, it adds an armature modifier, but I want to put this before the subdivision surface. So you can see the deformation happens first, and then the subdivision surface comes in and smooths everything out. Anyway, let's go Control Tab, pose mode, select everything, Alt R to reset the rotation. And by the way, you don't have to use X-ray mode for bones to appear in front. We can go back to object mode and select the bones. And under object properties, you can check this in front option, which will always render the bones in front of your meshes. Now we'll go over to edit, lock object modes. We want to turn that off. And the reason we're doing it is because if we go over to pose mode on the bones, let's select the head, it will switch back to object mode because that was the mode in which this object was in when it was last selected. Whereas if we were to enable that and go over to armature, go into pose mode, you can see that it's still in pose mode even when we switch. So let's disable pose mode for the armature. And then for the head, we want to switch to weight paint mode. So by taking that extra step, we're now able to control left click on these bones and see the different weights on these bones. Now for the top ears, they're looking great. Whereas for the head, I want to tweak that. So let's go over to the gradient tool and click on it, click and drag upwards. And the way the weights work is whatever is red is 100% affected by that bone. And it goes from red to yellow to green to bright blue and finally dark blue. So whatever is dark blue doesn't get affected at all by this bone. By the way, seeing as we're in weight paint mode, we can actually still rotate these bones. So Control left click on them, rotate them, see how they're affecting the mesh, and Alt R to reset rotation. Anyway, we'll just click and drag this and we'll paint the whole head together with the ears completely red. And the cool thing about the gradient tool is that it affects everything behind. So through the mesh, as we orbit, you can see pretty much everything is red right now. And then we'll switch to the draw tool. And if we were to set the weight to 0, because I want to unpaint the ears, if we orbit, you can see it's not affecting the other side. So to fix that, we want to go over to the brush and make sure you uncheck front faces only, and then go over onto fall off and set the fall off shape to projected. And now it will affect the other side as well. And the reason we're doing that is so we can now unpaint the ears. You can hit F, by the way, to scale up the brush size and just paint this out so it doesn't affect the ears. And by the way, I still have the X-axis mirror enabled, so I only have to do one ear and it will reflect the changes on the other side. Now we can hit R, it's still working fine. Now we can control left click on the bottom ear. And this time we'll switch back to the gradient tool and make sure the weight is set to 0 so we can get rid of all of that. And then we'll set the weight back up to 1 and we'll draw the whole ear. Don't worry about the top part of the ear right now, it doesn't matter. Just want to make sure the whole ear is red and then set the weight back down to 0 and then do this. And you can see it really does matter where you start the gradient from, because if we started over here and try to do this, it calculates the gradient from this point to this point. So you can see not much changes. So instead you want to actually start the gradient over here, which will have a lot more effect on it. And then maybe do it on this side. You can switch to local orientation. That looks good. And real quick, I want to point out that rigging, weight painting, all of this stuff is a topic on its own. So that's why I'm going a bit faster than usual. Now I want to show you something real quick. Because we use the gradient tool, when we control left click between these two bones, you can see it didn't really mirror the changes that we made. So this one is still not quite right. And now you may be thinking, oh my God, now we have to do the other one as well. Not quite. Just a moment. We'll fix it. So let's go over to the data properties where we have the vertex groups. We want to delete the ear right vertex group. So click minus, then select the ear.l.001 and then click on this arrow, copy vertex group, which will duplicate it. Then hit the arrow again and hit mirror vertex group. And finally rename this to ear.r.001 and maybe even push it up on the list. So now you got each vertex group weight painted on the correct bone. All right, now that the skinning is done, the shape keys and everything, we can start parenting things to each other. So let's redisplay everything that we need to see. We'll do left leg, left arm, right leg, right arm, and torso. And then also the blink control. The other ones are just as backup. We don't need to see those. Now we'll select the head armature. Tab to go into edit mode, make sure you select the head bone, so it's the active object. Then back out of edit mode, we'll select the eyes first, shift click on the armature last, Control P, and copy to bone. So now when we go into pose mode and rotate, you can see the eyes rotate with it. Same thing for the blink control, select that last, Control P, copy to bone. The origin is set at the bottom of the head, so the rotation is happening properly. You can go into pose mode for this, blink, you can move the ears, and so on and so forth. Anyway, we'll select everything, Alt-R, reset rotation, Alt-G, reset location. And I'll select all the limbs and the armature, and then select the torso last, Control-P, copy to object. So now everything follows the torso. And now because the head elements are parented to bones, we could actually go ahead and disable the head selection as well as the eyes. So we can't accidentally choose the eyes or the head meshes, that is. And let me tell you, when you get to this part where you get to enjoy the rig, you can move things around and control everything in real time. It really is such a rewarding feeling and so enjoyable to just play around with these. And by the way, I've been jumping back and forth between pose mode and object mode, which again is because of the lock object modes option. If this was on, it would be very frustrating. So we're here, go here, we have to go into pose mode, rotate this, go back here out of pose mode. So just leave that on and thank me later or right now with a subscription or a like. Moving on to animation, we'll first start off by setting the frame rate to 30 frames per second, as well as the resolution to 1920 by 1080, because those are the settings that we used in After Effects. Next, we'll add a new camera, and then Alt-R to reset the rotation, and then RX90, and then push this back. And I'm just now realizing that the robot is facing the wrong direction, so RZ180. And we can split the view if we hover over with our cursor. You see you get that plus plus symbol, so you can click and drag. You can even do right click here and then vertical split, and you can just click and drag there to merge those windows. For this window, we'll hit 0 to jump to the camera view, then go to camera settings, and down here under viewport display, you have this option that says passpart 2. We can click and drag that all the way to 1 and then hide the UI elements, hide the toolbar, so we only see the robot. And now we'll go back up. Let's set the focal length to something like 14 millimeters because I want this to be super wide. So as the robot flies close to camera, I want this fisheye lens look. And then we'll push it back like so. And then under background images, we'll toggle that down, add image, click open, and then locate your image sequence, which we exported, remember, right at the beginning. Hit A to select everything and enable the settings here. Make sure you have detect sequences checked and hit open image. And by the way, you can't see those if you have this turned off, so make sure that is on, which we'll use as reference now that we're animating the robot. So first, let's focus on the part where we have the robot flying through the camera. And to achieve this flying motion, we could animate the position of this guy to move there and then move here and then go here close to camera, and it would be so hard and you still wouldn't be able to get proper results. So instead, it's best to use curves in this situation and shape that curve's path so we can have the torso object move along the path in a smooth way. So let's go Shift A, we'll add curve Bezier, and then we'll go into edit mode. Let's select everything, rotate along the Z axis, and let's say bring one close to camera. We'll push this path over like so. And now back out of edit mode, we'll select the torso, go over to the constraints tab. Under constraints, add follow path and choose the target as the curve. Now, if you notice, there's some jagged lines going on here. So under data properties, let's increase the resolution to 64 so we have a nice curvy path. And now back on the torso, over to the constraints and then tweak the offset. So now we can go into edit mode, tweak the points, select these two ones, and then right click subdivide, which will create a point in the middle. I'm gonna try to match the path with this robot. So this one's coming up close. Bring it down a bit. So I'm moving the points on this view and then monitoring on this view. All right, now let's also go ahead and check follow curve. So it rotates to face the direction of the curve. And then to tweak the tilt, you can go over to edit mode and select the points and hit N, and you can see the option that says tilt. If you rotate that, you rotate the direction of the curve. And to better show you, we can go over to viewport overlays option and turn on handles. So what I want to do is this, tab out of edit mode, we'll go RX90 on the minus, and then at this point, I want the tilt of this to be towards the camera like that. Maybe push it like that. Maybe this point goes up, but the handle goes down. This turn here is a bit too tight, so let me scale that up. It doesn't make such a drastic turn all of a sudden. Whoop, you see? Anyway, I just wanted to show you real quick the tools you have at your disposal when working with curves as a way to have an object fly through it. So I'm gonna go ahead and speed through the process of trying to dial in this path to better match the original animation. And once that is done, I'll come back to you and then we can continue talking about specific details. All right, so after quite some time of playing around with this path, I think I finally have something that's actually pretty close to what the original one looks like. So now let's go ahead and look at the timing. I wanted to start coming in at frame 0, so we'll drag the offset all the way back until we don't see it in the camera view, set a keyframe, and then move forward in time where we no longer see it, drag the offset to the other side, set a keyframe, and then find the point in time where we go in slow motion and then increase it up until this point, set a keyframe, move forward back to real speed, set another keyframe, but this time we'll bring it back here and then right click replace keyframe. But now we want to go over to the graph editor by either switching it over here, or if you hover over the timeline, you can hit Control Tab, which will also take you to the graph editor. And then hit A to select all of your keyframes and press the numpad period key to focus all of those keyframes. And now I want to drag this over so it starts immediately and then kind of eases into it And then this one also drag that over. And then this here. And it very quickly goes back to real-time speed. And that just continues like so. All right, and I could actually just select all of them and make sure the pivot is set to 2D cursor, which in the timeline means the playhead, and then hit SX to scale it along the X-axis. All right, that's looking a bit better because before it was just too quick. So the main path animation is complete. Now it's up to us to go in and animate the details. So let's do the limbs this time around. And for this, I'll actually toggle the viewport overlays. I want to animate from this view instead because I want to see how those limbs look like from the camera's point of view. So early on, I want these to be a bit more visible towards the bottom. Right now, it just looks like it has no legs. So let's switch to individual origins, select both legs, and we'll do I to insert a location and then bring them down so we can see them better. And then insert location again to update those keyframes. And then right here, as it's spinning, we can maybe set some keyframes at this point. So I rotation keyframes, move forward a bit, try to carry that movement along. So it's making a turn, and then also bring them out. Maybe this one not as much, maybe this one a bit more. And then also you could rotate those downwards. Insert rotation, insert location, do the same here. And then as this moves over here, first of all, maybe Alt R to reset the rotation, double click R, something like that, push it up. During this slow down part, I want this to move outwards even more, as if it's going so fast that the limbs are literally detaching from the body. But we do need to tweak the easing, of course, which we'll get back to later once we animate the other limbs as well. At this point in time, once we go into slow motion, we can have the character blink. Let's actually do a wink instead, because I want to keep the double blink for the end part where the letters come in and then the small head logo pops up, because then it'll be a bit smaller. And so having both of the eyes blink is going to be a bit more noticeable. Now let's find a point in time where it goes into slow motion right here, and then go into pose mode, hit I, set a location keyframe, and then go up just a little bit, and then go down on the Z just enough, and go I, location, move forward, select all of them, and then focus them so you can go right in there. And then actually delete the X and Y, and then copy this first one and paste it here so it goes back to being open. We want this to carry on for just as long as the slow motion goes on. Maybe scale this up so the wink happens very quickly, and then he holds the wink, and then it goes back open, and that's where he flies off. So back into camera view, let's see how that looks like. So wink. Let me go into cycles render view, see if that's noticeable. Yeah, it is. Oh, wow. Oh, wow, it crashed. All right, now let's also take care of the ears, which I'm gonna animate only after we go into slow motion mode. So right from this point, let's select all 4 of those bones on the ears. Rotation, move forward all the way up until here. I'll rotate it on the X a little bit, and then rotate this one a bit more. And maybe on the Z, I, rotation. And then one last detail I want to add is to stretch out the torso just before he's about to launch back into real-time speed. Maybe right here. So let's go over to object properties and set a keyframe for just the Z. And then we'll move backwards a little bit, set a keyframe there. I'll shut off the offset and then move forward to this frame, SZ, and stretch the heck out of it. And then replace single keyframe. Now let's see. Okay. Actually drag the easing. You can just notice how he's like trying to launch himself out. And this is actually a matter of frames. One frame here can make a lot of difference. And then back when it goes off the screen, I wanted the scale to come back down. And now I'll go ahead and tweak the timing and easing a little bit more and then come back to you once everything is ready. All right, let's take a look at the final animation. Now let me go over to the rendered view and go back in time so I can see what's going on. And let me start working a bit on the lighting. So over to the world properties, we can switch this over to an environment texture. And we can use websites such as polyhaven.com to grab an HDRI. Let's see, sky, maybe this one. And then set the size to 2K, HDR, download. And then locate and import that HDRI and just make sure that you switch to use the scene world and then switch to shader editor. And if you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled, which you can do again by going over to preferences, add-ons, and then switch to the world and hit Control-T on the image, which will add a texture coordinate node and a mapping node. And that will allow you to rotate the HDRI. I want the bottom side to be a bit under shadow, the top side a bit more lit. But now I also don't want to see the HDRI, so we'll go over to the render properties under film, check transparent, then back to the 3D viewport for this window, and we'll go Shift A, light, area light, go to light settings, we'll increase the size quite a bit. We want a very soft light actually, bring it right up top, and we'll do 5000 on the power, and then we'll duplicate it, go over to the Z, and then hit RY 180 to flip it to the other side. We can use this as sort of a fill, and then rotate it like that. But we'll lower the strength to like 250 and then go back to the world properties, maybe set the strength to 0.5 so it's not as blown out. Let's see how that's looking in different frames. We actually want to size up the area light so it covers the robot the whole time. But now as we size it up, we need to also increase the power back up to double what it was before, maybe even triple. I want to shift this highlight to not be right above his blinking eye. So let's go over to the world properties. Under the vector mapping, we have the same settings as we had in the shader editor. Let's see, which one do we have to spin? Okay, this is more of a backlight now. Scale this up even more and then increase the power on this. And in fact, what I'll do is actually duplicate it. We'll move this over at the bottom left. So RX oriented like that. We'll scale it down. So it's a sharper light. Remember, the bigger the light source, the softer the light, but then increase this to like 10,000. So we have this really cool looking bottom backlight. Maybe we can afford to scale it up a little bit now. Let's see how that looks like across the entire animation. Yeah, it's looking very defined now. It's got all of these specular highlights. And that reminds me actually, let me select the eye. Oh, we can't do that because we disabled the selection. Go down, head armature, left eye, go under materials. And this is where we can tweak the roughness, bring it up a bit. Maybe we can tone down the specular back to 0.5 instead. Oh my God, so cute. Well, there we have the finalized first shot, I guess. And now we can go ahead and duplicate this. So we can go full copy to make a complete copy of that first scene. And for this, we'll go ahead and real quick reset all of the animations and everything. We don't need the path actually. All right, so I've gone ahead and deleted everything apart from the head and the camera. So we can start from scratch for this scene. Let's go over to the background images. We'll turn that back on, then go over to the camera view. And we want to move forward in time so we get to the last frame so we can start setting up the angle and everything. So with the camera selected, first of all, I actually don't want to have any perspective on this. So we can switch to orthographic view, or you could stay in perspective mode and just use the focal length, like blast it to like 300 millimeters. But that's a bit tedious. So I'll just go over to orthographic view and then tweak the orthographic scale. We can also shift the X and Y. And then with the armature selected, we can scale it down. So there we have the final position for our head. Now let's first start by animating the head bone, so the position movement and the scale as well. And I want to go back to After Effects so I can know exactly at what frame the head starts moving to the side. So it's on frame 76, and then on frame 106 it ends on its final location. 106, that's its final location. In frame 76, we'll move it to the side. Insert another location, and then go back here. We'll do eye scale and then scale it down to 0. Over here, eye scale. We can scrub frame by frame and try to match the position of this to the original reference. Switch to the graph editor and we'll select, what is this? The X location. Just drag this over until it roughly matches, and then we can scale these up. Oops. Based on individual centers. And I also want to tweak the scale values now. Increase the easing. By the way, we'll delete the Y and Z locations just for a cleaner timeline. And then let's go over to the bones. And this time we'll animate the Y rotation. Let's set a keyframe there. That's the final orientation. Go over to 76. Let's actually move a bit back just so I can see where I'm going. So I wanted to come in rotating from that side. So let's say 4 and then set a keyframe and let's disable everything. Select these, focus them, go back to frame 76. Make sure you bring this over here and then scale that up. And I actually want the rotation to lag a bit. Oops. And here we'll take care of the eye blinks. Just as he lands on the final rotation, we can insert a location keyframe and then move forward by maybe 5 frames. GZ, eye location, move forward 5 more frames and copy paste those keyframes over. And now finally we can do the ear animation wiggle. Let's just focus on animating the ears wobbling around a bit. Go to local orientation, individual origins. So let's select all of these bones, RZ, spin them that way, eye rotation, move forward a bit, RZ, spin them the other direction, eye rotation, and then let's say copy paste those. And this time we'll do a little bit less. Eye rotation, move forward, RZ, a bit less on the other side as well, R rotation, and then finally Alt-R to reset the rotation and set another keyframe. And now I'll just go ahead, select all of them, switch to individual centers. We'll hit S, scale them on the X, just so we can add a bit more easing. And then we'll select the top ones, select all the keyframes and just offset them by about 5 or 6 frames. So it looks like they're lagging behind a bit. Maybe that's a bit too much though. Let's say 4 frames. Okay. And then we can select all of them if we want to speed up the animation. Let me go back to the camera view, see if I can time these properly. So have them start. And I also want to maybe shift the timing of these blinks a little bit over. So he kind of settles in a bit and then blinks. We'll do Shift A, add a light, area light, bring it up. We still have the world, right? Yep. And then we'll increase that size. We can right click, adjust light power, and then just drag it to the right. And by the way, I want to have this be in the camera view so I can see, maybe bring it back. Increase the size to like 5,000. Shift D on the Z, RY 180. And for this bottom one, we'll tone it down quite a lot. So it's just like a fill bounce light and then rotate this so it's more of a backlight. Maybe you can turn on background so I can see it with a white background, but then turn off all of these bones and all of these things so it's not distracting me. And I can notice now that it's a bit too dark with a white background on it. So let's pump up that top light to maybe 4,000%. As for the eyes, let's maybe increase the specularity this time. I will do 1.5. And maybe scale down the top light, or we can scale it back up for a softer light, but then bring it back in that direction so I can isolate the reflection on the eyes a bit towards the top there. And then maybe increase the size of this, bring it up. We can bring it down and then back on the world. I don't want this to look too dramatic also, which will make it look a bit more horror-like. We'll leave it at that angle and maybe crank up the strength to like 2. All right, now let's rename these to text plus head and the other one to flying robot. And finally start rendering these. So we'll go to the render properties and make sure you set the render samples to at least 256. We'll use the denoiser as well. And then back to the output properties, we'll use the PNG format. Compression 0%, set the destination. Let's see, it starts at 0 and ends at 87. Then we'll tweak the settings for the other scene. Oh, and one more thing, you want to make sure to turn off the render visibility for all of the backup objects that we don't need to see in our renders. And then wait for them to render out. And after that, we'll go back to After Effects and finalize everything. Now, once your render is finished, you can go ahead and import those image sequences back into After Effects. And the first thing you want to make sure of is to go right-click, Interpret Footage, Main, and make sure that the frame rate is set to 30. Do the same thing for the other one, and then click and drag those into our comp. Let's go below, and let's shut off the spinning head. We'll move it to the side. Because we actually slowed it down compared to the original reference, it's a bit longer. So I'll go over to this point, and I'll click and drag everything, so they start coming in from this point on. And I also want the robot to actually be on top, so it covers the letters. I'm gonna unshy this so I can get to see the original head reference layer. Hit U to bring up its keyframes, and just line this first keyframe up with the first frame of the spinning head render. I don't know what we did, maybe we messed up the camera position, but it's a bit offset to the right, so we'll just correct that. And that shouldn't be too much of a problem. And then right click, time, freeze on last frame. So we can then drag that out to the end, reshy all of the layers that we don't need to see. Maybe we can color code these to orange so we know, okay, those are the 3D renders. And then we'll set the endpoint to 6 seconds, fit that to the screen, hit the tilde key to maximize the view, and then give that a preview. If you want to tweak the colors, by the way, you can add a curves effect, maybe pump up the contrast a little bit, maybe even a hue saturation if you want to. This way you can even shift the hue, so now it's a blue Android. Reset that, and then of course you can do the same thing to the flying robot, copy those effects, paste them here. Let's give them like 5% saturation, and do the same thing here. Alright guys, so we finally reached the end. Thanks for watching and being patient all the way through, as I understand that for some of you this might be a bit too much to take in all at once, but I wanted to cover every step in as much detail as possible, so you can follow along with me through a project from start to finish. Remember to check out my Gumroad page for project files where you can grab stuff that might come in handy, at the same time supporting the channel that way. If you're feeling generous, you could also leave a tip with a super thanks button, or join as a member with a monthly donation and get access to extra perks such as free project files that would otherwise have to be paid for. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.